King Solomon, the wisest man in all of history. The 20-something-year-old chose wisdom over fortune and fame, and God granted all of the above. His success and leadership ushered in Israel's golden age. He's credited for building the temple, lavish gardens, a beautiful palace, generating massive wealth through lucrative trade, and settling a heated custody battle by threatening to cut a baby in half. And this all sounds grand and noble, but there's a much darker side to the story that's lost in the misguided praise and glory. Quick side note, Bathsheba's traumatic experiences are allayed through Solomon's coronation and reign. Through the assault and great loss, she was elevated to Queen Mother, the second most powerful position next to the king. While this doesn't negate the evils committed against her, it does have a restorative quality in giving back some control and autonomy, and definitely deserves recognition. So we need to rethink this idea that Solomon was some rich stud muffin that all the ladies fawned over. Yes, Song of Songs gives some explicit and erotic content, but Solomon was not a passionate man that regularly offered gestures of romantic pursuit. Since he was well known and incredibly powerful, wealthy, and influential, it would be a common act for other kingdoms to use marriage as a diplomatic alliance. This would include daughters of the king and slaves that would serve in his harem. Pharaoh and King Hiram's daughters served this purpose to strengthen relations between the nations. More on Hiram later. But he only had 3 children, so the likelihood that he actually had relations with every woman is highly unlikely. Think of it more of a status symbol than holy matrimony. Plus, these women led Solomon to worship foreign gods, which didn't end well for him or the kingdom. He built altars for his wives, which included Moloch, the metal idol that scalded children to death as worshippers drowned out their screams with trumpets and drums. Not exactly a good look for the wisest man in history. The kingdom itself was divided into 2 groups: producers, the farmers, laborers, and peasant population who made the goods, and non-producers, nobles, merchants, and soldiers. The producers provided for the needs of the non-producers, who heavily depended on them to maintain their lavish lifestyle. We're talking 30 tons of flour, 60 tons of meal, 10 stall-fed cattle, 20 pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats. Not to mention the additional deer, gazelle, roebucks, and fowl. And that's just one day's worth of provisions. Solomon split the northern tribes into 12 districts that weakened their power and influence. Their loyalties were now centralized to Judah and Jerusalem rather than tribal authority. The people were heavily taxed, overworked, and their own storehouses raided just to provide for the very demanding king and court. Sure, it brought prosperity to Solomon and his noble entourage, but needless to say, the king was not well liked and social unrest rampant. While the temple is credited to the accomplishments of the king, it was actually a source of torment and despair. Solomon had the wealth needed to finance the temple, but what he didn't have were resources and skilled labor. So he reached out to King Hiram of Tyre. Hiram was a friend of King David and provided resources for him during his reign. By working with Hiram, Solomon expanded his political influence and strengthened economic growth, but at a hefty price. The original plan was for Israel to work alongside Hiram's men, and Solomon would pay the wages set by Hiram. But Hiram modified the agreement and said Israel didn't have the skill or knowledge to properly cut the trees, and the Sidonians were masters of their craft. So Hiram proposed his men do all the labor of cutting and transporting, and Solomon's men would take it to the location. Of course, Solomon readily agreed and paid the servants' wages, plus an annual 100,000 bushels of wheat and 110,000 gallons of pure olive oil. Israel was then forced to provide for the ridiculously lavish lifestyle of king and court, with the added burden of paying Hiram for his help building the temple. And as all things go, this was not sustainable. Eventually, Solomon was so deep in debt that he sold 20 cities to Hiram as payment, and the people who lived in those cities were now under foreign Canaanite rule. But you can't build a massive temple without a steady source of workers. Solomon conscripted 30,000 men under the authority of Adoniram, the man in charge of forced labor, and subjected them to labor conditions similar to those they experienced in Egypt. Merciless and harsh. Not to mention the combined hardship of being away from their work at home, trying to keep up with the demands of taxes, provisions for the court, and Hiram's payment. And this was the catalyst that led to the downfall of the kingdom. After Solomon's death, Rehoboam was approached by the people who begged that the burdens of oppressive labor and taxes be lifted. But having an immense sense of entitlement, Rehoboam was having none of it. Solomon may have been harsh, but he would be ferociously inhumane and tyrannical. To that, the kingdom split, and after many wicked kings on both sides, they eventually succumbed to exile. Solomon may be credited for his wisdom, wealth, and prosperity, but in actuality, he was a ruthless man led by selfish ambition. He exploited the peace and unity David established for the exploitation of economic growth and commercial ventures while marginalizing the people for his own pleasure. He was not placed in power by the popular vote of the tribes, but through palace intrigue and the belief that he was an absolute monarch who could do no wrong. The lesson here is simple. Just because you have wisdom does not mean you are wise.